Thank you. So I'm looking forward to this panel. We were talking a little bit at lunch, and we all view this, not just me, as a way to move from the past and the present more to the future. And sometimes I tell my policy students it's fun to think about policy from two different ways. What's feasible now versus what could be. Throwing feasibility to the wind. So I invite my panelists to think of the future in either one of those ways within the constraints of existing social and political systems, or maybe without the constraints of existing social and political systems. But I just wanted a couple things in introductory remarks. As most of us know in this room, gene editing is many things. It's not just one thing. You can make single point mutations. You can make insertions and deletions. You can add transgenic genes. You can add synthetic genes. So that's just one thing to keep in mind as we talk about this. And you can even have gene drives, which is almost it's related but separate in a way of how inheritance works and how you bias inheritance in certain ways over time in populations. So when we talk about gene editing, I just think it's important for all of us to realize when we talk with the public and maybe with each other today that there's different types. And if we need to clarify with each other, what type are you talking about, feel free to do that, as well as in your questions today. The second thing is that governance is not just regulation. So generally, and we all agreed at lunch, governance is broader than regulation. And regulation is a subset of governance, which are mandatory, sort of what you would think of as government regulations that have the authority of law. But governance systems, one can define from all the way to funding to how we engage with the public to what consumer choices are making, and then how those feedback loops evolve over time in society. So feel free to think of governance in that way as well, not just constricted to regulation. Although if you do have a regulatory question, I'm sure they'd be happy to help tackle it. So those were the two things I wanted to say, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the first question. And this is more of like a future visioning question in a way, and I'll have each one of you answer it for a couple minutes as well as introduce yourself. But what do you envision for the future of CRISPR, or more broadly gene editing governance? Do you want to start, Carla?
Sure. So good afternoon, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this, especially to Jennifer. I'm Carly Easter. I'm the chief of the Education and Community Involvement Branch at the National Human Genome Research Institute, which is one of the 27 institutes of the National Institutes of Health. And so I have to say I'm very encouraged to see the poll that said that you trust the government to help in this governance aspect. But I think for me, in the future of governance, I'd love to see there be far more partnerships between public-private institutions and the public. And the public not just being the informed public, such as people that are here, us at this conference today, but really thinking about working with those communities that have historically not been represented. And so certainly thinking about those communities that are sovereign institutions within this country, or even outside of this country, but thinking about governance in a much more public way, and being able to think about the applications to the CRISPR technology or any of these gene editing technologies, how it will impact those communities directly. And I think we've heard from many of the other panels today about the issues of trust. And certainly with regard to governance, I think to build those partnerships, we need to build that trust. So that I would certainly like to see in the future a much better structure in which we encourage far more voices in the conversation.
Great, thank you. Donovan?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Donovan. I'm currently a student in technology and policy at MIT. I'm not wearing that hat today. I'm also part of a group called the UN Major Group for Children and Youth. To keep it short, is essentially the formal mechanism within the UN system for meaningful participation of young people in various different intergovernmental processes as they relate to systemic issues and sustainable development. It's entirely youth-led and volunteer-based, so we don't have sort of any links really to the UN, but we do have a protected seat that allows us to engage in deliberations. I'd also like to thank the organizers for giving us the space and having a young person speak on the panel. A lot of the implications of CRISPR and other gene editing technologies take a long time to realize, and we only see them in hindsight. And so oftentimes it's young people now who inherit a lot of the responsibilities, both positive and negative, and have to deal with them. And was also encouraged to see a lot of students in the crowd both yesterday and today. In terms of looking at the future, one observation that we've had is sort of the increasing gap or misalignment between the rate of technology change and the way that we understand uncertainty. And this sort of indicates that the current governance frameworks, regulatory and engagement mechanisms might be inadequate. So we've mentioned there are existing frameworks, but they're not sufficient. One way to approach this is to reduce complexity to human scales, where we simplify models, make it linear. But we don't think that's a good approach because we've talked about really the interactions and the complexity. So rather, we like to look at it as enhancing our capacities to understand that complexity. How can we develop mechanisms or protocols for analyzing the risks and developing frameworks that have very elaborate economic, social, and environmental indicators of the potential impacts of technologies, both short-term, long-term, intended and unintended, which is how the OECD defines it. And these should be grounded really on people-based and planet-based parameters, because that's really at core of the issue. Also, strong scientific basis. And one way to do this, for example, is that any funding that is given for these types of technologies, a certain percentage should be earmarked for ethics, bioethics, and research on societal consequences. So 2 more points, if I can. Going back on this notion that we often see the impacts in hindsight, we need governance mechanisms that really promote technology justice, that are inclusive and anticipatory, essentially shifting from those that are often reactive or responsive policies to more so proactive ones. What we like to say is that we like to deal with emerging issues before they become emergencies. The UN system is notorious for this. They're just now starting negotiations for migration. They're just now starting discussions on antimicrobial resistance. I mean, it's way too late in the game, so we don't want to fall in that trap. And also, shifting the discussion away from the market-driven obsession with delivering innovations and focusing more on effective ways to innovate the delivery of existing and proven technologies that can have an impact. And then the last point is sort of to what Carla mentioned, has to do with fundamentally rethinking how participatory engagement looks like. We think that oftentimes outreach by technology developers can be biased to validate preconceived notions. The previous speaker from New Zealand talked about the notion that just engaging a small sector of a community isn't a proxy for wide societal acceptance. And not having a checkbox exercise when trying to engage a wide array of communities. We had a very nice breakout session this morning on intergenerational engagement, and I think over lunch as well. So really, how do we work with the community, share knowledge, build capacities so that the discussions are more informed, and also we can bring in a whole community of innovators that can actually identify potential issues we hadn't seen, but also provide solutions looking forward in the future. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Larissa?
Hi, my name is Larissa Rudenko, and I used to always start my talks by saying I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. What I'm happy to say now is I was with the government, so that was the number 2 trust position, and I'm now an academic, which is the number 1 trust position, so trust me. Everything I say is true. So I am currently a visiting scholar at MIT. You have 2 of us from Boston here. But prior to that, for the preceding 15 years, I was the originator and director of the Animal Biotechnology Unit at the Food and Drug Administration, and worked closely with folks at NIH on moving from contained to non-contained trials of various technologies, of various products, excuse me. And before that, I worked in venture capital, and before that, I worked in as an academic toxicologist and molecular biologist. So this is the 3rd side of the desk. I'm trying to figure out how many more sides of the desks there are. I think one of the things that has been talked about here, but I don't know how much traction it's gotten, is the title of the conference is CRISPR and what CRISPR can do for you, or what CRISPR can't do for you. The reality is in the United States, we will not be regulating CRISPR. We will be regulating products. We do, and we will be for the foreseeable future, regulating the products that are made using various kinds of technologies, including CRISPR. In Europe, there's a different governance system and a different regulatory system where people regulate technologies. So GMOs, which have become a four-letter word, I have a little trouble with the math on that one. But there are directives for the regulation of genetically modified organisms. Here in the United States, as Greg mentioned yesterday, we had the Coordinated Framework for the Regulation of Biotechnology in 1986. It was just updated last year at the end of the Obama administration. That was one of the last things that I worked on. And that basically lays out a framework of what part of the US government regulates products at what time. And one of the most important things that is in the Coordinated Framework that many people don't notice is that when the statutory authority seems to go to more than one agency, a decision will be made as to which agency goes. But because there is a presumption of equal rigor of analysis across the US government, it is incumbent on the regulatory agency in the first spot to seek expertise from other regulatory agencies and use them within their own statutory guidelines. So that's, in point of fact, what we do. So if there's an environmental issue that comes up for the FDA and we don't know that much about that particular kind of environmental issue, we'll go to Fish and Wildlife or we'll go to NOAA and ask for expertise and get a consult from there. There's a lot of stuff that occurs behind the curtain, so to speak. And so I was a student of the FDA before I went there. I thought I really understood what was going on, and it took me about 5 years to figure out that I didn't have the slightest idea what was going on before I actually went there. So I think, again, the important thing is that there are people who are regulating products from the technology, not the technology itself. Where will we go in the future? I hope that what will happen on the regulatory level is that we will become much more inclusive, but it has to be within the constraints of the statutory authorities. So what does that mean? That means that I'm the kind of lady who will sit here and tell you, I'm sorry, I know you have an opinion about this, but the law says safe and effective, right? So if the statute is the law, that's what the regulator must do. They must determine whether something is safe or effective and say yay or nay, or ask questions until they're satisfied as to whether or not they could say yay or nay. It doesn't say you will hold an open session with the public and ask them how they would like to have it regulated. That's done by going to Congress. So if you want to change any of the laws or any of the regulations, you go to Congress. But that doesn't mean that's governance, right? That's regulation. That's only one part of the decision-making process. But it's because it's one part of the regulation of the governance process that has form to it, it's where a lot of people go to try to air their concerns. And they become very frustrated when they hear, no, we can't do anything with that because we're not allowed to. So then the issue of governance comes up, and I'm hoping that what will happen is that during these periods when technology becomes ascendant, but the products have not yet come on the market and there's no established paradigm or maybe not even a guidance, which is the agency's best recommendations on how to submit data and information on a product, and it doesn't have the force of law, but it is a set of recommendations. During this time is when we might be able to develop some mechanisms, some fora, in which we can incorporate all of the stakeholder and participatory issues that people would like to discuss and have them actually be heard by people. That doesn't mean that they'll necessarily be taken into account as part of the safe and effective regulatory decision, but not all decisions depend on what an agency says. There could be a decision by whoever's developing the technology to take it forward with full gusto, or to maybe say, no, maybe this isn't what we ought to be doing. Maybe the funders will say, this technology has a lot of promise, and I can see an application that's going to be great. And here in the Bay Area, we have an ecosystem where we have a lot of money floating around, a lot of ideas about apps. Well, biology isn't going to have the killer app. Biology is going to take a long time. But at least you may have funders flowing some money into the system, or they'll say, hey, nobody's going to buy this. I'm not going to invest in this, right? So there are all kinds of things that can happen as part of a governance system that are not part of a regulatory system. And I thank you, Jennifer, for bringing that up, because that's a really, really important point here. And I think what our other panelists have been talking about are governance and not just regulation. So
Yeah.
in the future, I hope we will incorporate more governance into the overall process.
That's great. And so we'll come back to this before, because I think it's an important discussion. But let's move to Greg and give you a chance to address the first question of vision for governance, and then come back to some of these issues of how you reconcile the regulation and governance divide.
So my name is Greg Jaffe. I'm the director of the Biotechnology Project at the Center for Science and the Public Interest. CSPI is a nonprofit consumer group dealing in the food and nutrition area. We're located in Washington, D.C. We're the people who always tell people not to supersize it, don't go to McDonald's too often. But our goal is to sort of make sure we have healthy eating by everybody. So I work on biotechnology, genetic engineered foods, crops and animals. And I guess I wanted to raise 3 points that I think are related to governance issues. And I appreciate Jennifer saying that, that there are lots of different ways of doing gene editing. I think we've, in some ways in the last day and a half, had too much of a binary kind of discussion. But there are many different kinds of gene editing, and we have to separate those. So I think the first thing, and I'm sort of taking a consumer perspective, working for a consumer organization, is we have to ensure safety. When I'm coming from the agricultural food context, that's the most important thing to consumers. You want to go to the supermarket and make sure that you're choosing among all safe food. And you want somebody else to make that decision for you. You don't want to go in the supermarket and have to figure out or look at scientific journals and decide, is this safe or not? I only want to choose among safe foods, and I think that everybody does. So I think that, to me, is a minimum standard, a bottom line, and I don't even think you get to a lot of these other governance issues unless you have a safe product. And again, it's not the technology, it's the products of the technology, and so are those safe? So I think that is, a sort of, that's not for negotiation. That's sort of a no-brainer in my mind. The second issue, I think, is transparency, and I think transparency is crucial. And I don't mean to suggest that CRISPR applications are going to be stealth in any way. I'm sure that scientists are going to publish their papers about it in peer-reviewed journals. Other scientists in their community will know about it. I'm sure developers are going to take the traits that they've developed, and they want to sell those. They want to brag about those. They want to build a market for those. But transparency has to go all the way through the food chain and all the way to the consumer. And I want to make it clear that when I'm talking about transparency, I'm not talking about something like mandatory labeling or anything like that. But I am talking about the fact that, we talked about trust yesterday. Roxy talked about it, and others talked about it. And we do have an internet world, and so people are going to find out. The idea that consumers aren't going to find out that this mushroom has been gene edited or not is not something we can't expect anymore in this day and age. And if they find out about it and they realize it's been hidden from them, that people don't know about it, that their grocery store doesn't know about it, or where they got their food didn't know about it, that's going to be problematic, because people are going to wonder, why was this hidden from me? And if they think about that, they're going to assume the worst. So I think you have to build into the system some sort of transparency, whether it's a registry, a government registry or something, but if we're going to have applications of CRISPR that are going to get into the food supply, there has to be a way that people know about that. So I think that is a critical thing that I think is part of governance. It may be part of the regulatory system, but it is important. And the third thing I wanted to mention was that for food and ag in particular, we have an international marketplace. And I think the discussion the last day and a half has focused a lot about the US. But if we're going to talk about governance, if we're going to talk about regulation, the reality is that a lot of other countries and a lot of other parts of the world are going to have the same discussion. And the likelihood of everybody coming up with the same decision, I would say, is near zero. And so we have to build in, what are we going to do about that? So we need to both consider what other countries and other parts of the world are doing and other peoples and so forth. But I don't think we can go to a lowest common denominator, because then nobody might have benefits of this if there was one country or one group that said, no, that can't be the solution. So we have to build in coexistence. And I know I don't mean that in the terms of we might think about it on a farm, but in a broader sense of coexistence within the marketplace. And we have to figure out ways to coexist so that if the United States wants to move ahead with certain kinds of gene-edited products, they should be allowed to do that. If other countries may not want to do that, they should be allowed to do that, but we shouldn't have veto power over the other. We have to figure out ways of marketing things, ways of getting along with that. And so I think that has to come into the governance. It's almost an international kind of thing. But I think we have to realize that the conversation, while we may decide for ourselves in the United States one way, others will decide other ways, and we have to figure out how those coexist, how they work together, so we don't stop this technology or applications that are safe and beneficial from moving forward.
That's great. Thank you for bringing up the international, because we have an international participant, but we are missing some of the more developing world perspectives on the panel.
May I
So
follow up?
Larissa, you wanted to follow up.
On the international issue, and I think Greg brings up a really important point. And I don't know if all of you are aware of the various bodies, international bodies that are concerned with international harmonization for basic safety standards for some of these foods. There's the Codex Alimentarius, which is run out of the WHO, the World Health Organization, FAO, the Federation of
Food and Agriculture.
the Food and Agriculture Organization. So these are international bodies that convene generally early in the promulgation of a technology. I was involved with were you involved in the Codex stuff?
I was not.
Okay, so I was involved in the Codex Alimentarius guidelines for assessing the food safety of foods from what they called modern biotechnology. And because we couldn't decide on genetic engineering, which is what the Food and Drug Administration insists on, and Europe often uses GM, genetic modification. For the US government, we've been modifying food since we first started planting seeds. And GMO, which is a colloquial term, but has no regulatory significance with respect to approvals, although it may have some regulatory significance with respect to the GMO-free label. But the important thing is that there are international convocations where regulators and other interested parties, including public interest groups or industry groups, come together to address the issue of how can we all agree on what safety studies should be done to determine the safety of a food that's derived from this or that. There are also international harmonization guidelines for medicines, as there are ISO standards for manufacturing. So there are lots of places where you can take some of these things, but those are technocratic solutions. I think that's an important point to make.
Yeah.
So Greg's
Great.
first point is, first you determine safety, that's non-negotiable. There are places where you can go to determine safety and whether or not everybody's in compliance with it, and to set technical standards for manufacture. The other issues are left to geopolitical units because nobody wants to interfere with the sovereignty of another geopolitical unit.
So to follow up, I want to come back to this side of the panel. You both did such a great job of envisioning what the future is, that let's come back, and there's something I'm trying to reconcile in my own mind, which is this kind of process of mandatory regulation, but then the willingness and the eagerness in some cases of people to participate and have a voice. How do you two who deal with the public engagement side of things reconcile that in your mind, that if you are to engage people to have a voice, does it fit into regulation? Or if it doesn't, do people get disappointed that they don't have a voice? So how do you reconcile this fundamental kind of tension of the safety perspective versus the have a voice perspective? Not that they're irreconcilable, I'm just wondering how you do that in your work. For example, Carla, on your work with engagement in NIH.
I think one of the ways that we've dealt with this, well, obviously there are opportunities for people to respond to the regulations that come out, but obviously you find that the public is not always as engaged in responding to the things that the federal government puts out for comment. I think one of the ways that we've tried to do this, and certainly we recognize that individuals don't always represent complete communities, but one of the ways that we've tried to do this is to bring together individuals who represent communities who can then go back to their communities and bring this information to them. I think that one of the major concerns about the information is the delivery. And so oftentimes the delivery of this information might be through websites, it might be written. We don't often take into consideration the level of literacy of people who need to get this information. We don't take into consideration the fact that federal websites are not always responsive in the sense of people are using smartphones now more and more, but if you can't get on the website and you can't download what you need, then again, this whole mechanism of being able to respond is really not as equal as we'd like to think it is. So again, I think the idea of bringing in those voices who can help us determine how to best engage people with this conversation is incredibly important, because we have standard mechanisms in which we think work, but that may not always be the case. And so reaching out, again, that issue of trust, building trust, and making sure that when you ask for the information, that you are going to be, as much as you can, responsive to it, but also actionable. And that it's just not lip service, that we just didn't go out to the recommended group of people and just take their information, that truly we're going to take this information and do something with that. So I think there are a number of different areas in which we try to think very strategically, but also being very realistic about, are the mechanisms we're using the best ones, and the information that we're getting back, are we actually going to be able to do something with it, or are we just asking it for the sake of asking? And again, I think that's where this issue of trust comes in. So it's one of the things that we have found is working with communities and being very clear to them about what we can do and trying to meet those expectations very honestly.
Donovan, do you
Sure.
want to jump in with your work on?
On
yeah,
the
go ahead.
international part, and then I'll come back.
Absolutely, sure.
Perfect, sure. I think you set up a great discussion. Just to add some of the reflections we had from our perspective, is the recognition that the impacts of technologies don't respect artificial borders or natural ones either. And so we sort of see the importance that when these sorts of technologies and their impact transcend borders, then you need sort of a global mechanism for governance, for horizon scanning of emerging technologies, and for technology assessment, and to do that repeated across time since things change. We like to use that technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral, because it depends on who is using it, what ecosystem it's in, and it changes with time. And so a body like that is necessary. Our colleague Jim from a previous panel mentioned this new structure in the UN system, the Technology Facilitation Mechanism, which has a mandate to look specifically at this issue. And so we as stakeholders should engage actively in that. In terms of the policy levels, we also always think there's importance of coherence across global, national, and local levels. Otherwise, we sort of have the fear of proliferating the notion of dual-use research of concern. So there's a very fine line between bio-error and bio-terror. And if there aren't minimum standards and protocols that are agreed on globally, then it's an issue and it leads to tensions like we're seeing with nuclear weapons, despite the fact that there is a non-proliferation nuclear treaty. And then just the last point is that even though there are a lot of policy frameworks, one of the caveats and issues is that many of them are voluntary in nature. So for example, one protocol, the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, which was an extension of the Convention on Biodiversity, the US and Canada are not signatories.
Right.
And you sort of ask yourselves why. Are there vested interests of developing the technology nationally? And so looking at sort of the issues of biosafety from that perspective as well. So now just to get back on the question of engagement, I'll just make some quick remarks on that. How to do citizen-based and participatory-based engagement, I think you've laid it out quite well, so I won't repeat. What I think is also important when developing frameworks for risk assessment is establishing thresholds. Oftentimes, socially, thresholds are often based on values, and different communities have different value judgments. From the environmental side, there are very clear biocapacities and environmental thresholds and carrying capacities that nature endogenously has, and that should be our threshold. And I think there was an article that went a few weeks ago or a few days ago that went viral about how we've essentially done more harm had more of an impact on nature than it's given us. And sort of the rate of consumption is more than the rate of natural production of resources. And then just to cite one example, some of you may have heard of the Worldwide Views, which was an initiative by a few governments a few years back during COP19, a climate conference. And they were able to do 70 consultations in as many countries on the same day on these issues, engaging community members to talk about the hard questions. And all of that feedback was synthesized and brought to policymakers to integrate in their negotiations. So that's a great example.
That's great. That's a good catch on the safety studies, so that there's a place where values come into regulatory decision making at the point where you're setting that limit. So maybe we'll return to that with Larissa. I might follow up, but first I know Greg wanted to ask or respond to something that was said.
Right. I just wanted to say, I mean, we have these international treaties, and I'm very familiar with the International Biosafety Protocol and the supplementary protocol and things like that. But those only go so far. And the reality is that I work in a lot of developing countries. Countries want to make their own decisions, and they use those as minimum standards, but they end up setting up their own laws that follow some of those things. They may have different aspects to them, and that is the world we live in. That countries still want to have their own sovereignty and make their own decisions. And so international agreements only take us so far in the process, and I think you have to keep that in mind. And the other thing is, and I'd assume this will be similar with gene editing as it has been with genetically engineered products, is most of those are domestic. And in many countries, they will be used only domestically. And so none of those international agreements to some extent apply to them because they're not crossing boundaries, and most of those agreements are about between countries. And so I think that's one of the misleading things that I deal with in Africa all the time, is that the Cartagena Protocol doesn't apply to a local institution in Uganda producing a virus-resistant banana that's going to be grown by their own farmers and eaten by those same families. And so I think we also have to keep that in mind, that there are that those agreements only they serve some very important purposes, but they also are limited in what they do.
So just to return back to Larissa, I would like you to comment on sort of the point raised here that people want to have a voice and that there are some values in safety assessment. So who determines safety now? And you're an expert on this, obviously. And how do those values come into play in regulation versus governance? Maybe I'll just leave it at that and see what your thoughts are on that.
Wow, that's a lot right
It's a
after
low,
lunch.
yeah, but how do values play into the regulatory system,
Okay,
I guess?
so
we all agree they should play into governance, but how do they play into regulation, or might they in the future?
Okay. So this is going to be a lot to take in right after lunch, because I'll probably put you right to sleep. But once upon a time, long, long ago, a bunch of people got together and wrote a red book. And the Red Book is what it's called, was one of the first delineations of the distinction between risk assessment and risk management. And this, what was very clearly stated was that risk assessment and risk management were two separate activities, but they needed to interact. So how does one... So if we talk often about risk assessments and we talk about safety, what's the difference? All right, so if you think about first of all, there's no such thing as zero risk, all right? There's no such thing as complete safety of anything, okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing we need to understand is that there are no bright lines between risk and safety. So sometimes when we try to put bright lines in places, we blind ourselves. Okay, so we want to try not to do that. So safety is often, risk assessments are good scaffoldings on which you can hang data and information so that you can determine whether something is a hazard, whether it's capable of causing an adverse outcome, how you might be exposed to that, and if you're exposed to it, what's the probability of having an adverse outcome? So for those of you who are nerdy, it's a conditional probability analysis. For those of you who are not, it's the stuff that people do to tell you whether or not something's going to be okay. Right? So what means okay? That is the critical distinction between risk assessment and risk management, and where norms and values come into play. You have to remember that these fields were developed for small molecules that didn't have a biological potentiality. They were just chemicals. And so we're pretty confident when we do a risk assessment of 2,4-dimethyl chicken fat, for example, that we have some sense of, from animal studies, where the animals get sick, at what dose they don't get sick, and blah, blah, blah. And then we say, because we don't know how well the animal model reflects the human model, we're going to put a safety factor in it. That's a value, right? So a safety factor of 100-fold. So that means if we're going to draw a little box and say that inside this little box, we know that this is where the rat or the mouse first has an adverse outcome, we can put that point here. And we're going to say, well, we're not really sure whether humans will have the same response, so we're going to move that target higher. That's a values judgment. And then we're going to say, well, we don't know whether all people are going to react the same way. So let's add another safety factor for that. That's another values judgment. So that's how values come into the apparently scientific perspective process of risk assessment. Safety is values-based. Safety says, if this is my risk sphere, where am I reasonably sure I'm going to be safe? Okay? And so those are often thresholded. It's a fairly bright line that says, if you're at this exposure, we're pretty sure you're going to be safe. So, okay, we could do this for the products of biotechnology, whether or not it's a genetically engineered canola or a genetically engineered fish. What do we do about things like gene drives? Because you told us to think about all kinds of genome editing. What are we going to do about gene drives? Well, the answer is, so far, no regulatory agency has come up with a decision on gene drives because nobody's gone to a regulatory agency with the gene drive product. Okay? So here we are early in the process, very early in the process, and what's happening? We're having the conversation, aren't we? Maybe not everybody, maybe not everybody's been invited, maybe not everybody can attend, but we're having a conversation about it. And that's part of governance, and that's part of values. And whether people use gene drives to help solve problems of extinction, or problems of invasive species, or problems of promulgating a particular desired trait through a population of an organism that we find economically important, may be resolved in places like this. It may be resolved in boardrooms. It may be resolved at regulatory agencies. But it's all part of the process. And you, by being here, are part of that process.
Good point. Does anyone want to respond to anything that's been said before we move to the audience questions? Or should we move on to the audience questions? All right, we're ready. We have questions. Unfortunately, my phone is, here we go. Okay, the top question. Well, this is, it's an interesting question, and so I think you could all kind of respond to it. Now that CRISPR is out in the wild and broadly available, isn't the future of CRISPR determined by its users? Do you think that's a true statement or not? And if so, why? If not, why? So in other words, how does the user have a voice in the future of technology, and in this particular case, CRISPR or gene editing?
I'll take a run at that. If you know.
Okay.
So CRISPR is out there in that people can buy CRISPR sets and go do their own DIY or you know, those kinds of things. There's a program called the International Genetically Engineered Machine, iGEM competition, where there are students ranging from high school all the way through graduate students around the world. I happen to be a judge of, and I'm on the safety committee there. And they come up with all kinds of fantastical ideas for how to detect arsenic in groundwater to help protect public health. One interesting project I had was to develop bacteria that would take the accumulated acid rain off of statues of the historically important buildings. These are kids. They're 16 through 22 years old. Those of you who are 22, I apologize. But these are great ideas, and this organization is governed by the safety committee and a set of bylaws, and there are units that are allowed to be used in it. And so this is an example of governance as opposed to regulation. So CRISPR is sort of out there, but it's not really out there because it's not really, again, the products of CRISPR are what you're thinking about. It's not CRISPR per se. You can buy a CRISPR. What you can't buy is a product made from it just yet.
I would agree with that because as I was telling the panel over lunch that I've been working with a group of 7th graders for the last 2 years because they're creating lesson plans on CRISPR and the ethics behind CRISPR. So this idea that it's already out there is true, and that inevitably you will have in classrooms teachers using CRISPR kits to basically do all kinds of interesting things. And so again, the question is, as an educator from that perspective, who's governing this? Well, you're governing it. You're the teacher. You're doing these experiments. You're making these decisions. Inevitably, when the Intel Science Fair starts to ramp up in the next couple of months, there'll be a bunch of students that are using CRISPR, a tool, for their experiments. So again, I think it's already out there, but I think the question is, when we start to think about the applications of it, that's where this becomes very case by case. And if you're using it for an application, like you said, gene drive. So for instance, if we want to go back to thinking about more traditional diets and thinking about modifying food that basically is more traditional in nature, going backwards, who's going to regulate that? And who's going to say whether that's good or whether that's bad for a community that has the desire to do this? So again, I believe the applications are going to be where we start to see the questions of governance.
And push-pull is big here.
Yes.
And Donovan, you wanted to jump in here with something. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just an interesting observation about the word technology. You have in it technique. And inherently, technologies, depending on how you use them, influences the impact you have on the world and the way you interact with it. And that's the importance of having the proactive discussion like this. You don't have the discussion too late when you're sort of in that emergency phase. The reality is that it's out there, and the question is, how do you make sure that it's used for the right purposes and not for the wrong ones, which is the whole, problem with biosecurity, and also not to widen inequalities. And some of that has to do with setting a compass or a direction for what is acceptable as a society, what have we decided, and making everyone aware of that. But of course, those who have ulterior interests will continue with those interests. And so the question now is, well, who's accountable? Right? Is it the person who's actually developing it? Is it the raw material supplier that we can track to know who's actually buying supplies to develop CRISPR technologies? So what other potential mechanisms are there for raising sort of red flags or warnings of potential misuse of the technology? Which it's hard thing to think about.
Yep. Very difficult concept. Almost requires a different form of governance in a way if you think about the DIY community and biosecurity as well. Greg, you wanted to jump in?
I'll go ahead.
Okay, we'll move on to did you want to add anything to that, Larissa, the end user? Or you're good?
I'm good.
All right, so now the real top question is, because I did not have the top question before, apparently I was on some other screen. Which do we want CRISPR to be, a democratized technology or a strongly governed technology, and are the two in conflict? So we were already talking about democratization. Is that in conflict with regulatory, top-down, sort of mandatory, strongly regulated or strongly governed?
Again, the issue of technology, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of CRISPR being democratized.
Right.
It's a matter of the applications
Right.
of CRISPR being available to people.
Right.
So I think it's really important for those of you who are still thinking that technologies
Right.
get regulated, try really hard to put on the glasses that say product. And-
Except when you think about the CRISPR kits or what have you, there would
but
be the
still,
potential
you're going to
to.
have products and
Yeah,
so on.
right.
But
Yeah.
let-
Greg, go ahead.
So
yeah.
I guess I want to, I did work in the government. I was sort of a regulator for a number of years.
Being in remission is great, isn't it?
I guess I want to dispel the notion, I think that's behind that all regulation is bad somehow, or that regulation is negative in some sense. I think we all get into this view, and I think it's maybe from the GMO debate, that there's too much regulation or regulation. Our environmental laws, our food laws, our laws have many different kinds of regulation, and you can have light regulation, for not a better word, or heavy regulation for, and again, those aren't really good words to describe it, but we have the Toxic Substance Control Act, which for many years was just sort of a notice and go. It was regulation. It required people who had new chemicals to let communities know what those new chemicals were in their communities and have emergency evacuation plans. There was no approval of them. There was no, it was an information statute. That was regulation. So I think, I think there's too much of this view that all regulation is bad. Similarly, I come from the food context, and we have HACCP regulation to ensure, to reduce food safety. Many food companies will say, this is what we really want, and we want to do it because the good food companies are doing it. We want to get the 10% who don't do it to do it, because any one bad incident affects the whole food chain and has a negative impact on everybody. People want definitions in labeling for whatever labeling it is, so there's uniformity, so people can plan. So I think there's this movement around that all regulation is bad or all regulation is very heavy-handed. And I think we have to broaden our views of what is regulation, what is oversight, and there are many different things on that spectrum, just like there are many different applications of gene editing on a spectrum. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, that a lot of regulation can actually move products to market, and it can enable markets and can grow markets and so forth. So I think that's just something I think that's sort of underlying that question that I needed to bring out.
Good point. Great
So
point.
one more point is, there are unintended consequences of regulation as well. And they've been alluded to, I think Cassie alluded to them in the food panel. And that is, there is a cost associated with regulation. There's a cost to the producer to demonstrate safety. And that cost is very high, because the public has demanded that the demonstration of safety, the assessment of risk, and the estimation of safety be as certain as possible. And so it costs millions and millions of dollars to bring a product to market. It will cost tens of millions of dollars to bring a CRISPR therapy, CRISPR-based therapy, to the clinic. Okay? And part of that is just the costs of setting up and doing the studies. There's investigational science, where you come up with ideas, investigator-initiated research, or foundation-driven research, where people do discovery. And then there's development and doing the studies, the regulatory science that goes with this. And it's very, very expensive, right? So the unintended consequence is that big companies, deep pockets, I'm not going to call it companies, because I think that's a really bad mental model for us to be using. Deep pockets will drive what products get to market first. And that's where the public has a pull function, right? We need this. We want this. If you build it, they will come, right? So if your community needs or wants something, make your voices heard It's not enough to say, I wasn't invited to the meal, I wasn't invited to the table, so I'm part of the meal. Get yourself to write the menu, as Pastor Mike might say. So, it's really important. If it's important to your community, whether it's an agricultural application or a medical application or a bioenergy application, the pull function is non-trivial because it will drive funding in.
So it looks like we're not going to get away from agency speak here, which is okay, because I do think the top question is there are significant differences in the ways of FDA and USDA proposed to regulate new biotechnologies. And so what are those differences, I think, is the first one. And maybe, Greg, you want to take a stab at it, and then Larissa, and then you all comment maybe on the health aspects and the international aspects as well. And then how do we get a real coordinated framework? So this is kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but you all are interested in it, so I don't want to deny it. So, Greg?
Okay, so a lot in that question. The short answer to the first part is that the regulatory system that's being applied to gene editing is the same one that was applied to genetically engineered crops and animals, and that is sort of using old statutes and applying old statutes to a new technology. And when you do that, you sort of have gaps and ambiguities and overlaps and overregulation and underregulation. And so what FDA has proposed for under genetically engineered animals, they use the new animal drug provisions, the definition of an animal drug, and so any change to the genome would trigger the new animal drug provisions, and any intentional change to the genome would trigger a new animal drug provisions. And so they have a draft guidance out there that says that therefore all gene editing, intentional gene editing of the genome would be a new animal drug requiring mandatory pre-market approval. On the food side, they have a different legal mandate, and under that legal mandate, the plant side.
Plant food side.
The plant side, they have said that similar to genetically engineered crops, they will have a voluntary consultation process because manufacturers can decide that something's generally recognized as safe unless it's a food additive, and they haven't defined this as being a food additive. So you have a difference there based on the legal issues. It's not a scientific decision. They didn't do a risk assessment. They haven't looked at particular products. It's based on the legal applicability, what's in the law and applying the law to potential products there. USDA has regulated genetically engineered crops under the Plant Protection Act. They've done that historically under the idea that if you're using any plant pest component in either your genetically engineered construct or in the DNA that you're introducing into the organism, then into the plant or organism, then they regulate that. For gene editing, in many instances where you're, for example, just deleting some base pairs and you're not using a plant pest, a plant pest organism to do that, then they would not regulate that. And they've said that in their draft regulations that are out there. And in fact, they've also said that in letters to potential developers. So those won't be regulated. But again, that's not a science-based or risk-based decision. They have not looked at the CRISPR mushroom and said, there is no risk here, so there's no need to regulate. All they've said is it doesn't fall within our legal mandate, so we don't even have the authority to go look and see whether there's a risk that should or should not be regulated. Quickly, so where would I think things should go if you wanted to have a real coordinated framework? I mean, this may be radical, but you should throw out the old statutes and you should set up a science-based, risk-based system. So ideally, that would have a single door. The idea of multiple agencies leads to overlaps and gaps that are not most efficient use of things. So the best system would be a single door agency. I think Jennifer was your National Academy of Science study that talked about a single door entry point, and then as Larissa said, that agency could always look to its sister agencies for their expertise. So instead of having 2 or 3 agencies approving a product, you would have one. You would want, in my opinion, you want a proportionate risk-based system. We've talked about different kinds of gene-edited products. So I think everyone would agree that making a single base pair deletion or silencing a gene might have a risk profile associated with it. That would be different than editing 6 or 10 genes that change a metabolic pathway, maybe turn it on, turn it off. That might be different than editing 30 different genes in a organism, and that might be very different than introducing a gene from that same species, from a different variety, from introducing a gene from a different species, from introducing a synthetic gene, as you mentioned. And I think everybody would agree that all those have different risk profiles. They shouldn't get the same regulatory treatment. There should be different buckets. And that's what I mean by a proportionate risk-based system. On one end, that might only mean notification. It just might mean a notice and go. So we have that registry I was talking about, that transparency. On the other end, it might be a full-fledged risk assessment and a fairly precautious system, proving safety before going out there. So you could have a range of things. And that's why I think we need to look at this more creatively. I do think that system should have transparency associated with it. You need that. And I would also say flexibility. We've mentioned today CRISPR. I don't know what the new gene editing technique will be tomorrow or 5 years from now. You don't want to keep going back to Congress and getting new laws or changing your regulations. You really need to build in flexibility so you have that flexibility so if new techniques come along and different risks may be associated with products with those or not, you can deal with those in an appropriate way. So I think those are some, in my mind, some of the sort of principles that you would have if you wanted to have a really coordinated system.
So I want to turn over here for a second because we've been talking a lot about risk-based, and this is sort of a follow-up to that question. What do people out there in communities that you're talking with, what do they think a risk is, and does it fit into the notion of what the kinds of risks are that we regulate in the regulatory system? And if not, then how do you envision us taking them into consideration in governance? So what is a risk and how can we take them into consideration to people who want to have a voice? Or
Again, I think the communities that I work with, because we focus on health, many of their concerns are the enhancements or the changes of the genome. And obviously we're far off from thinking about this, but again, most people seem to be very concerned about will this technology be used for bad as opposed to good. And within that, again, it's that you said values. What do people value as good or what do people value as bad? And again, I think a lot of this stems from the fact that we haven't done a very good job of explaining to people the science. The fact that there still is this idea that it's a very easy process and that people don't quite understand that it's much more complicated than just going in and making a change, that there's still a misunderstanding. And a lot of that may come down to just the fact that as a society, we're not very good scientifically in terms of our literacy about things. And we've dealt with this from the Human Genome Project perspective, that trying to get people to understand what this whole project was about and what the benefits were. In some ways, we might have oversold that and what the expectations were, because people thought that once we had it, we would solve all the ills that affect us genetically. And I think that's where people are thinking about CRISPR on the one hand, but just as it will solve all of the ills of health, what are the evils that people could do? So I think that's really a concern. And so a lot of conversations stem around the ethics of this and who will make the decisions about is this good or is this bad? And will certain communities be left out of that discussion more importantly? Will they not have the voice to decide at what level is this going to be good? And how do we separate communal from individual?
Good.
And so again, I think those are a lot of the discussions we're starting to hear because again, there's not a clear understanding of the technology itself, but also the idea of we may have oversold this and about how easy this could potentially be.
Good. Donovan, do you want to add anything to the meaning of risk out there in the world?
Sure, a little bit. I definitely sort of agree with what Carla and Greg said in terms of needing a new paradigm for regulatory frameworks. I mean, I think it was yesterday's, the pastor mentioned that disruptive technologies call for radically new systems because the current ones are inadequate. And what we like to sort of add is that you need to qualify that when doing the risk assessment. How do you outline, you know, as I mentioned, social variables, economic variables, environmental variables that cover the whole scope of what a community looks at? And how do you localize and contextualize that discussion and the trade-offs that that community might feel? One of the fears that we have is the rapid sort of movement towards the need for quick decision making. We think that the culture of seeking these sort of immediate results actually prevents and refrains any type of structural change that has to be based on deliberation, and it takes time to talk with these communities. Especially, I think the survey indicated that most of the room is sort of precautious of what are the potential implications, and so we need time before just jumping to certain regulations. And also, I think communities are worried that the cycle of regulatory capture, Stiglerian capture of private sector interests of technologies, and the influence of funders on research and on regulations might actually lead to increased inequities, and making sure that there's a very clear delinking from certain private interests and funding sources to the actual research and making it science-based.
Larissa, do you want to add anything to?
Well, I think Carla is the most important player here, because she's reaching out to the kids. She is part of the educational program, and I think we do have a low level of scientific literacy, but we do have to be careful that we don't revert back to the knowledge deficit model when we start talking, when the community writ large, starts talking about applications of this technology. So for those of you who don't know, the knowledge deficit model is a lot like if you're in Paris and you don't speak French, you ask in English, how do you get to the train station, and the person looks at you and says in French,
He won't answer you.
He won't answer you. So what do? You repeat the question louder, right? So obviously the deficit is on his side because he's not understanding me. So the more I shout, the more he'll understand me. Well, guess what? That doesn't work, right? So for a long time, when people were trying to communicate about either the benefits or the risks associated with some of these new technologies, scientists assumed that I remember how annoyed I used to get when people used to come up to me and say, Larissa, you just think that if people knew what you knew, they'd think the way that you think. And I was like, yeah, sure, why not? Yeah, I'm right. But the reality is, trying to throw more data at people is not a useful way to try to get people to understand what you're talking about. Notice I didn't say to get them to agree with you. We're not talking about any kind of intended coercion here, just to try to get some communication going. And you don't do that by taking, as Deborah Tannen would say, a one-up position from somebody. It has to be real communication. You have to listen, you have to engage. So that's why I think this knowledge deficit model just hasn't worked. We have to think about the elephant, because it's going to be, as Greg said yesterday, because we all have elephants that we ride. We think we're making our points, but we're not really sure. But Carla is actually doing something to change things. She's actually, a regulator may deal with whatever is coming in the door today, but what she's doing is trying to change the way people will think about it tomorrow. And I think that's really important.
Greg, you wanted to follow up on
I just wanted
this.
to, so your question was about risks, but I also think, I don't necessarily call them risks, but concerns that I hear out
harms,
from people.
whatever you
and
want
so
to
I
add.
think there are two concerns that I hear both domestically but also internationally in a lot of the countries that I go to. One is the concern about control. So controlling of the technology, controlling of the products of the technology, controlling whether that's of seeds, whether that's of the food that people are eating, their food security, things like that. So that I think is one issue that I hear a lot. And the other one is, I'm going to call it choice, but it's more like that somebody else's choice is going to limit my choice. So that somehow, if they do this, then I'm not going to be able to do what I want to do in that way. So I think those are two things that people, that I hear a lot around these new products that come from these new biotechnologies. And I just wanted to bring those out as something else to think about.
So where, I think, just in closing, we have just a few more minutes. Okay, two questions for everybody to address maybe in just a couple sentences. Where do you think we need to go, if you were to take a first step tomorrow towards better considering these broader consequences, if you will, and it doesn't have to be regulation, what would that first step be to move in the direction towards better governance? Carly, do you want to start with that? Or do you want, anybody want to start? I don't want to put anybody on the spot. So one doable step, actionable item. Go ahead, Donovan.
I think the first step is to set an example. I'll just share from our group, the Major Group for Children and Youth is a constituency that's over 6,000 youth-led organizations. Of course, not all of them are interested in genetic engineering. But before the conference, we did a very open-ended survey. We received about 45 responses from organizations and actually some young students in the crowd here. And that sort of informed some of the dialogue that I actually shared with you. So it's giving them the opportunity to have a safe space for sharing their thoughts and concerns, and then finding the avenues where that can be communicated. And now learning from CRISPRcon, we're actually going to delve into a much deeper consultation-based assessment with a community of young people. We've already discussed with others in the crowd how to work together across different stakeholder groups, across different generations, and then continue to find opportunities to bring diverse voices and find avenues to communicate those, to try to influence the narrative of the discussion. So I think setting an example is sort of first good step.
Great.
So I would say I don't have a good solution as to where we should have that dialogue, but what I can talk from experience is if we don't have that dialogue, I think what happens is those concerns get dressed as safety concerns within the regulatory system, and that causes the regulatory system to lose credibility, people to feel like they're not being listened to, and so forth. And then people don't understand whether regulators are making safety decisions or making decisions based on other things. So the message I would give is we need to separate those risk assessment safety kinds of regulatory things from these other considerations. We need to find a place to have those, because otherwise, if we don't, they indirectly come into that system and they put pressure on that system, some of that pressure not being good, I think, in governance.
I think,
overall.
again, the conundrum is that's the only place with kind of the legal authority where people can, really see an impact. If they have these conversations, who's going to listen, I think, is what some people are concerned about, outside of those regulatory areas where the government has to respond to the comments and such. If we have these broader conversations, are there people that'll listen and be responsive to that, and take into consideration? So I think that might be part of the concern. But Carla, and then Larissa, you can have the last.
What Donovan was saying, I do think there is this desire to empower individuals, and Donovan and I were talking a little bit about this. I do think youth is a fantastic place to start. One of the ways that we have found is that these sort of intergenerational conversations, because children will talk to parents, and sometimes in many ways are the interpreters for their parents of these kinds of things. And I've met someone at this conference who is here for her daughter, because her daughter has this interest in this. So again, I think one of the places I'd like us to really start having these conversations are in schools, as you pointed out, but in all schools, not just well-resourced schools, not just magnet schools, but all schools, so that the voices get heard from everybody, but also the idea that these children are then going to go home and talk to parents who may in some way be disempowered. And so again, I think there is this ability to use young people because they have a natural interest and a natural curiosity, especially in the ethical issues, because this is going to be their world, and they are going to be having to make these decisions and have these conversations. They're already having them amongst themselves. That if we could start there, I think that might be a great place to begin the conversations.
Great. Thank you. Larissa, last word. We have like 1 minute left. Where would you start? Temperance.
Temperance. And I don't mean the temperance where you don't have a drink, because I really need one after being up here. But I think temperance and tolerance, I think we need to be respectful human beings of each other's and each other's perspectives. I think that there are myths that are being perpetuated by proponents and opponents of the technologies and the products of the technologies that are self-serving, and that either serve as incentives for investment in stock profiles or clickbait. And I think what we need to do is to be tempered in our approaches to the products of these technologies and how they are dealt with, and understand that these are complicated times, complex times, complicated issues. We all have a lot to learn, and we can learn from each other. So is there one place to have these conversations? And, you know, I've spent 20 years trying to think about whether there's one place. And I think I've come to the conclusion that there is not one place. You know, yes, there is a regulatory decision that needs to be made, and it serves as a focal point, and there is a conflation of values at that point. But that's only because that's where people think they can go.
Yep.
So we need to find multiple venues, find the multiple places where push and pull can interact, and be tempered about how we talk to each other and respectful of the space.
Great. Well, let's thank our panelists for an engaging conversation.